The FGC is booming. Since 2021, there has been a new Guilty Gear, a new Tekken, a new Street Fighter, and several other fighting games with mild to huge success. It's easy to look at these massive games in the industry and see them as the only options you have. However, indie fighting games have carved out their own places in fighting game history, with their own little niches and unique traits. Take a look at Lethal League, a perfect example of an indie fighting game. It's balanced, fun, and provides its own unique spin on the genre that you won't find anywhere else. It may not have too many players nowadays, but sitting down to play this with a couple of friends makes for a great time. But what about the really indie games? The ones so obscure they have review numbers in the single digits. I believe the only such thing as a bad fighting game is one that makes no attempt to do anything new. So, I found 3 very obscure but free fighting games on Steam to review and recommend to anyone looking for something fresh, or at least I hope I can recommend them. I tried to go for ones that looked like they were trying to do something original, whether it be artistically or mechanically. My goal is to find a game or two that deserves recognition from the FGC for having its own unique gameplay loop that is genuinely fun, deep, and interesting despite its obscurity. Our first game is going to be Rainbow Core Hypernova, or Rainbow as I'm going to call it for short. When I saw this on the store page, my interest was immediately piqued. The visuals were super stylistic from the get-go, not to mention the incredible music. It had only 141 reviews, which is a somewhat decent amount, but still not a lot. So, let's get into it. For a quick explanation of the controls, Rainbow is a 2.5 button fighter, as I would call it. You have A, which is a light attack, B, which is heavy attack, and a dash macro. You can input 4-4 or 6-6 to dash, but the dash macro is required for a specific input I'll discuss later. As you can see, there are 7 different characters to choose from, most being based around a specific archetype. There's Red, who's your basic Shoto, with a DP, a move that's kind of like a fireball, a forward advancing move, and well-rounded normals. Orange is the puppet character, whose A normals only control your character, while the B buttons only control the puppet. Then Yellow, who's a rushdown, who is fast and has good mix, but lacks range and therefore struggles in neutral. Green is a massive but slow grappler with long-range normals. Blue is a charge character with set play and zoning elements. Indigo is a mobile zoner who can lock down neutral with his guns. And Violet is a set play rushdown who can create clones and teleport to them for some scary mix. Every character has access to a couple specials and a super. All specials can be inputted with A or B, and if pressed with B they become the EX version, costing some meter but granting enhanced properties and enabling them to be done in air if they were not already air okay. So that might sound kind of generic, and I won't lie, a lot of these characters' movesets are dull. However, this game functions with a combo system that I was unsure about at first glance, but I later found myself really enjoying. Whenever you take damage, your health doesn't just go down, but an invisible Super Smash Bros. Style percent goes up. So what I mean is, at high health, your opponent's attack will do hardly any knockback, and at low health, you'll be bouncing across the stage on every hit. As the defender, both circumstances have pros and cons. At high health, certain mid-screen combos will work that otherwise wouldn't, but you also aren't vulnerable to getting wall-bounced from huge distances. At low health, the inverse is true. You'll fall out of a lot of mid-screens, but you're vulnerable to getting wall-bounced if you're anywhere near the corner. As the offender, this is super fun because it combines the technical and practiced combos of 2D fighters with the free-form improvised combos of platform fighters. Here are some combos I created to show off what's possible in this game. As you saw, these combos get pretty silly. A few final things to mention about this game before we move on is that it has a DI mechanic like in platform fighters, which you can actually spend meter while doing to increase the power of your DI. And I will say, I think DI is fine, but Rainbow DI, as it's called, is a little too strong in my opinion. It really shuts down combos pretty hard. This game has an FD mechanic like in Guilty Gear, which allows you to push your opponent back while blocking, and allows you to block in midair. There is the Rainbow Dash mechanic, which can be inputted after an attack by inputting A, B, and dash, and this is kind of like the game's Roman cancel, as it costs some meter but allows for extensions, but I never actually found this to be super useful, but it exists, I guess. There's also Hypernova mode, which is a universal install that sets your super meter to a timer. While it ticks down, you can freely use metered options as much as you want, but getting hit will immediately end it. Rainbow is genuinely a blast. It isn't perfect, but if the dev were watching this video, here's what I would suggest. Add the ability to backdash in the air and generally speed up all backdashes because they feel kind of weird and slow and clunky. Make it so that when you hold the dash button you continuously run forward. This was just a little pet peeve, but it did bother me. Improve the menus because they are buggy and kind of hard to read sometimes. Make inputs just a little easier. I know I'm some loser hitbox player, but every input requires that every single direction be inputted pretty precisely, so the super inputs and half circle inputs were kind of a pain for me. And also, Blue's vertical charge inputs are difficult to do, and they usually just come out as a jumping attack, and that wasn't just me, it was everyone. Also, Orange doesn't feel like a great character both to play as and against. The puppet doesn't do that much, especially since there's no way to make the puppet act on its own. Whenever you want to do something, your character has to stop and press a button, and this can make it difficult to use the puppet in combos. And on the other hand, playing against Orange is annoying because the puppet is literally zero risk. The other player cannot damage it or move it, so their only option is just to avoid it. And lastly, I think some moves should be changed a little bit. I don't totally mind that the game has a super small list of moves for every character, but I do wish that the moves that the game does have were better and each had their own clearly defined purpose. For example, Indigo's dodge special has hardly any iframes, and isn't quick enough to act out of it even if you were to dodge anything, and I genuinely couldn't tell you what any of Orange's specials are for. But generally, that's all the negatives I have to say. I wish there were more characters, but I guess there aren't exactly more colors of the rainbow to add. Rainbow Core Hypernova gets a 9 out of 10 from me for being super fun and utilizing its own unique mechanics super well. The only reason it didn't get a 10 was because of the buggy menus. I think Rainbow DI is an annoying mechanic, and certain moves that are just nearly useless. However, this game is awesome. It deserves a ton of recognition, and I would love to see a tournament for this game. Anyway, let's move on to the next game, which is going to be Duels of Fortune. This is the newest game on the list as it was released in December of 2023. You'll immediately notice the game's UMVC-esque art style, with cartoon and comic book inspired graphics. This game has a fairly big roster with 17 mostly unique characters. First things first, just a little disclaimer. One major problem I experienced almost immediately with this game was it has no online mode. So my friend and I that I was playing with had to Steam Remote Play, which was annoying, but I promise this is the only game in the video where this is an issue. And I won't be criticizing the game too harshly for this because I assume this is planned to be added in the future. This game is still being developed, so updates are sure to come with time. Duels of Fortune is primarily a 4-button fighter, that being light, medium, heavy, and special. But you also have super, burst, and taunt buttons. This game is incredibly simplified compared to other fighting games. There are no motion inputs, and almost every character has the same number of moves. With a few exceptions, every character has standing moves, back moves, crouching moves, and the same in air except for there being no down moves in air. While this does lead to some characters feeling pretty similar, the game does have some pretty good variety in its character designs. It doesn't take itself super seriously, with there being a character literally named Shoto, and it chooses to embrace the silliness of fighting games and do whatever it wants, whichever they like. Shoto is pretty basic, but he has a few interesting quirks. His neutral special, or 5S, is a projectile that follows an arc through the air that can be modified by holding a direction after inputting it. While that's all fine and cool, the really fun part is that it can hit the back wall of the screen and bounce back towards the opponent. And this can be done in the corner or in mid-screen, and this makes for an incredibly powerful corner pressure tool and neutral tool, which is crazy. And that's not even to mention the fact that this guy has a totally safe DP that he can actually combo off of. These choices are questionable, but I'm all for this new and crazy stuff. So not only did I play some of the versus mode, but I also played quite a bit of the single player arcade mode, which was, for the most part, about as good as every other fighting game arcade mode. It was nothing special. I battled a couple of mediocre AIs, and then after one round, this happened? I have no idea why the devs chose to add this, but while playing this game at about 11 o'clock at night, I honestly was more scared than I would like to admit. This was just so weird and out of place. It ended up being just a weird kind of platform minigame, but man, for a second I was genuinely scared that the game was haunted or something. But anyway, I cleared that pretty easily and moved on to the boss section. The first boss was this guy who was basically Shoto, but in a different color, and he was really no harder than any other opponent so far. And you just TP. The last opponent is the person who I believe runs the tournament and is probably going to be the antagonist once the story mode gets added. This boss was really something. The first phase was fine, as this is his playable form that you can actually select in the character select screen, but the second phase was just like, man, it was really bad. I struggled for a really long time. Okay, that's actually sick. I don't even know. Hello? This really annoying thing keeps happening, where I try to input back special, but it does normal special with like the back arc. Cool, armor. Yo. Who normalized fighting game bosses being unfair? He doesn't seem great at blocking low. I think I've figured him out. And nice game. Was that like 6 tries? And there isn't really much else to write home about this game. Like I said, I think the biggest appeal to this game is the roster. You have banger characters such as Justin O'Guy, Clyde Brightstar, Derek Stone, Blackheart, Doodle, Sir Rattlebone, Mystery Johnson, I Parked My Truck to Be Here Guy, and Azutron S-Type, to name a few. I spent a decent amount of time messing around with some of these characters in training mode, and despite the fact that their basic movesets don't really stand out a ton, I think every character has some gimmick that makes them feel really unique and interesting. Derek, for example, despite just looking like blonde Shoto, has an RNG item throw mechanic like Faust from Guilty Gear. This skeleton guy looks basic, but you can throw his head and do these weird combos with them that are genuinely pretty fun to figure out. Also, side note, it turns out that the super strong one-button DPs I was talking about aren't invincible, so they aren't as crazy as I originally believed. For some final thoughts, I think this game makes up for its basicness with its diversity and uniqueness in its roster. Here are some suggestions that I have. Remove air drift. It doesn't add anything and actually makes the game worse, I believe. For proof, take a look at this clip in which I was playing Baron and my opponent was Annie. Annie's 2S is a little projectile low that we dubbed Projectile Stun Dipper. Yes, it's as annoying as it sounds. And after being thrown out, it deploys itself as a mine which can be activated remotely by Annie. Baron, being the grappler archetype, is slow. My approach to getting over this in any other game would be to jump over it and hold back so I can air block it but still move forward. But, because air drift exists, I would just jump above it and then drift back to where I started, ultimately achieving nothing. I had literally no counterplay to this one little mine. I think zoning should be generally nerfed also. This kind of goes along with the last point, but in the matches I played against my friend, it very much seemed like zoning was the best archetype. This is partially due to air drift, as I said earlier, but also because of the lack of double jumping. Most characters do have access to an air dash, but there is no jumping in air whatsoever. If you've been watching some of the background gameplay, you might have seen this clip where I was playing Clyde, and yeah. Maybe in the competitive Duels of Fortune scene, these attacks are somehow gimmicky knowledge checks because of some mechanic I'm missing, but it seems like this is just unbeatable. And lastly, I think what this game really needs to set itself apart is some kind of unique universal mechanic that allows for extra depth beyond a basic level. Guilty Gear has the Roman cancel, Tekken has sidestepping and heat, even Rainbow had DI to set itself apart. But Duels of Fortune just feels so basic. I love that this game has such an awesome roster of characters, and it's honestly just a blast to lab every character, which is a huge compliment. But that doesn't make up for the game being otherwise so simple. I think a good comparison for this game in some ways is Dragon Ball FighterZ. In both of these games, every character has the same inputs and same number of moves. DBFZ makes up for this by having mechanics like Dragon Rush, Spark, Super Dash, Assists, Vanish, etc. It has the extra oomph to make the game more fun and also giving it depth. If you tried to play DBFZ without any of those mechanics, it would be pretty boring. Unfortunately, that's kind of what Duels of Fortune feels like. With that in mind, this game receives a 6 out of 10. It's bland, it's basic, but it has a ton of potential. Like I said earlier, the game's still in development, and I really hope the developers stick with it. The foundation for a great fighting game is there, but it lacks the depth to be super fun. The novelty of this game's roster does fade after a few hours, and at that point you start to become bored since there isn't much else to sink time into. All in all, I'm excited to see further development, and I plan to come back to this game when it receives more updates. The third game we're going to be taking a look at is Head to Head. This is a very unique fighting game that is kind of doing its own unique thing. Released in June of 2021, Head to Head is an extremely stylistic 2D fighter that sets itself apart in ways you could not even imagine. The very first thing the tutorial tells you about is movement. In this game, you don't walk or run. Every character has a step dash that functions very similarly to Johnny's dash in Strive. Your jump is assigned not to up on your joystick, but to a button, since it is considered an attack in of itself. The controls are relatively simple. Your movement is purely left and right. You have no up and no down. There is no crouching. Your moves are attack, jump, special, and anti-air. Each of these moves have grounded and aerial versions and can be inputted while holding neutral, back, and forward for different outcomes. So for example, grounded neutral attack, or 5A, looks like this. 4A is this, 6A is this, and the respective aerial versions look like these. There is also the fifth button, the skull button. This button is a kind of miscellaneous button that can be used for a few different things. The number of times you can use it is limited each round, but it may act as a burst, a teleport, or it can give you access to a powered up version of any other move. So as you might have noticed, this game already seems super irregular. It truly plays like no other fighting game. And also I should mention there's a parry mechanic where if you press forward at the same time you would take damage, you recover much quicker and take no chip damage. Currently, there are only 5 characters: Redhead, Scarlet, Beastwole, Wrecking Ball, and Skull Kiddo. Each one feels relatively fleshed out and fun, with Redhead being the simplest kind of Shoto character, Scarlet having long-range normals and good whiff punish, Beastwole being the slow but big damage grappler, Wrecking Ball the zoner, and Skull Kiddo is pretty similar to Redhead with a few differences here and there. Predictably, the neutral in this game is a little strange. The unorthodox movement was initially interesting, but I feel like it had quite a few downsides. What's great is that it kept the game fast-paced. You are always moving and always trying to keep track of where you are and where your opponent is, and you're always trying to find the best button for the current screen positions. However, one thing that it made really annoying was blocking. When a projectile is thrown at me, I have to either parry it or block right before it hits, or else I would just end up at the other side of the screen because I was backdashing away. Jumping over it is also difficult, since jumping is so committal. In this game, there's no such thing as an empty jump, and you also can't air block. Once you're in the air, you won't land until your character has done something, even if that something may potentially leave you vulnerable to a counterattack. Generally, blocking in this game is super weird and kind of generally discouraged. Chip damage is much higher than most other games, and since there's no crouching, there are also no low attacks. That may have sounded like I'm talking negatively about this, but I actually don't hate it. Since there's no such thing as mix in this game, reacting to throws or lows or overheads isn't a problem. Instead, you are discouraged to play defensively by the massive amount of chip damage that you'll be taking. As an offender, this means that your focus is not to open up your opponent with mix-ups, but instead pressure them with chip damage or bait an attempt to escape and punish it. Damage is also relatively high in this game, so making a bad move can be very scary. The natural consequence of this gameplay is kind of the same problem as the last game. Zoning is extremely powerful. This isn't usually a problem, since most characters don't have access to a projectile that goes upward, so it is possible to counterplay most zoning by punishing with a jump-in. But Wrecking Ball has great projectiles that cover aerial and grounded space. This naturally made him incredibly annoying to play against, and I know I didn't play the game for a huge amount of time, but I would definitely think that Wrecking Ball is top tier for these reasons. And that, I believe, is this game's biggest flaw. Another thing I would point out as annoying but not terrible is that you do have to get used to how the inputs work. If you just quickly press J4A, for example, after a 5J, it'll come out as an aerial backdash. In order for the J4A to properly come out, you have to hold back and press A during the startup of your backdash. This isn't hard, but it's kind of just weird and it takes some getting used to. So here are some suggestions I have for this game, if it were to receive future updates. Obviously, nerf Wrecking Ball. His full screen abilities don't have a long enough recovery and are way too easy to spam. Update the inputs to prevent getting a random dash and messing up your combo because of it. When I press back and attack, I should get 4A, not backdash. Prioritize the attack. Next, make the skull system a little easier to understand. The tutorial made it seem like you start with 10 and the amount decreases after each use, but in-game, it seemed more like it starts at 0 and then goes up with each use. I don't know if that's the only difference since there's so little information provided, but it was significant enough to confuse us mid-game. And those are all my suggestions. I really don't have a lot of negative things to say about this game. It's super interesting, has a ton of depth, and is really unique. But before we end this chapter of the video, here's a quick combo reel to celebrate the fact that this game is super fun to lab. So overall, this game earns itself an 8 out of 10. The overpowered zoning combined with the messy input system makes for an occasionally frustrating experience, but otherwise it's very fun and a very unique fighting game. And that brings us to the end. To conclude the video, I'll say some final thoughts about these 3 games and give them some meaningless awards. I personally give the Best Art Style award to Rainbow Core Hypernova. This was close between Rainbow and Head to Head, but ultimately I prefer Rainbow's colorful contrasts, interesting character designs, and fun animations. Most mechanical depth goes to Head to Head. You can tell the developers spent a ton of time theory crafting this game. There's a lot to explore in the training mode alone, and all of it only gets deeper when you're fighting a real opponent. Most impressive roster goes to Duels of Fortune. The game's characters are definitely its strongest point, but it also wins Best Single-Player Experience. This game's arcade mode had lore and unique stages. Head-to-Head also had a unique single-player mode, and it kind of functioned like a roguelite. You could get upgrades to your character after each round, but they were kind of insignificant and didn't actually change the way you played. So that award goes to Duels of Fortune. Overall, my personal favorite game of this video is Rainbow Core Hypernova. Each game had their own strengths and weaknesses, but I think Rainbow's weaknesses were the least impactful on my enjoyment. But what do you think? I really recommend you grab a friend and try any of these 3 games, and if you're concerned about it, Rainbow and Head to Head both have rollback netcode. And maybe, if enough people show support for this video, I'll consider running a tournament for one of these games myself. This video took me almost 2 months to make, so if you liked it, feel free to subscribe and like and comment and whatnot. That would make my day more than chocolate ice cream.